Fantastic. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started here. I apologize for all the delays to everybody joining us over the internet and everybody in here. But we are Hawkeye Technology. We are a CGT 411-450 group. And we have our final presentation here for you today. So let's go ahead and hit the next slide for me. All right, we have two distinct teams under Hawkeye Technologies. We have a level of detail team and a screen capture versus animation team. And on the level of detail team, we have Tony Butcher, we have myself, Nick Delcourt, and Zach Carnahan. On the screen capture versus animation team, we have Josh Schleishman, Brett Gastineau, and Sam Schreiber, who are up here with me today. Our main sponsor is Dr. Hartman, who's joining us here today as well. And Professor Davis out at the airport let us use his students during his class time as test subjects. So I want to thank those guys for doing that. Next slide, please. Just some background. Dr. Hartman is the Associate Professor of Computer Graphics Technology. He is also the Director of the PLM Center for Excellence. That is the lab that let us use resources to complete this project. And Professor John Davis is Assistant Professor out at AT. So we'll get going here. Dr. Hartman and Cessna came together to give us an opportunity to work on a new project for their visual information delivery system. And obviously, as you know, Cessna is a very good company, and they are under the parent company of Textron, who makes many great products that everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with. Next slide, please. So to start us off, our elevator statement on everything that we've been doing. Textron Incorporated is looking to improve their visual information delivery system for assembly, manufacturing, and maintenance. What we're doing as a group is we're trying to analyze what the effectiveness of 3D dimensional modeling and 2D dimensional modeling in work instructions is. And we're doing this at various levels of detail and different delivery methods, such as screen capture and animation. What we'll be doing is improving on the current method. Our process will utilize an emerging technology that will allow the user to better visualize, comprehend, and perform the tasks that they need to do at hand. Next slide, please. Since we do have two groups, we have a level of detail group and we have the screen capture versus animation group. We do have one overall group statement, and that is the problem statement that's sort of a catch-all for us that we can use for the whole project. And there's a need to improve the visual comprehension of aircraft work instructions in the digital form to provide the aircraft maintenance, manufacturing technology technicians while limiting the file size and improving clarity. Next slide, please.
This here is an image representing something you would see the manufacturing and maintenance technicians would see. It is this is obviously something that has some obstacles as far as being able to rotate, not being able to rotate and zoom. It's all in just line. It's just lines. There's no shading. So this is something that they may see currently in the current process, and definitely something we are wanting to improve on. So our problem statement was derived not solely, but one of the big kickers was the three variables that we really wanted to focus on that would allow us to have some measurables we could run some statistics on to really feel like we could prove whether it was better or not. Those variables were errors, time on task, and mental workload. So overall there was a need to determine the level of detail that would minimize these three variables, and these were derived from past legacy projects as well as what we felt like we could accurately measure and kind of make summaries from. Next slide. So this is a previous group. We are a legacy group. For those of you that don't know what that is, it's basically a project built upon another project, and we are, I believe, maybe the 5th generation or so of these different legacy projects. The most recent one was this past spring, Arrowhead Tech. They compared the same three variables that we did, and they focused on the iPad usage versus a computer workstation. And ironically, there were more errors with the iPad. So this was something that was somewhat encouraging to us because we knew Textron wanted to use a workstation, and they wanted to kind of reflect their layout on their floor that required their employees to move from workstation to workpiece and not have the actual instruction right there in front of them. Assembly required, they tested for the same three variables. They were looking more at 2D and 3D task cards. They saw no statistical significance in time, but they did see that the 3D decreased the number of errors, which was another thing that was encouraging because we're pushing all of this to 3D, and if we have data that represents that 3D is better, it's only continuing to improve that evolution. Our research findings, we wanted to focus on CAD complexity and level of detail a little bit with our initial research, and we looked at the cognitive load theory, and fairly self-explanatory, removing extraneous information, background information, is improving the learner efficiency. So when we created our work instruction, it was solely the steps on the left, and then the model, and the background was very simple. There was no things in the background to cause confusion. The varying skill set and comprehension levels was something that we didn't have a whole lot of time to address specifically with what we wanted to do. Like Nick said earlier, we used students in 2 different aviation classes. This research here talked about the novices obviously tend to make more errors than the experts, and one thing that we kind of discussed as a group was potentially having a work instruction and in different segments to where the experts, the novices, the intermediates, they all have maybe they have login credentials, maybe it's based on years of experience, or whatever. If a novice doesn't know what he's doing, he may get a work instruction that is a lot more detailed versus an expert where they're able to condense some steps and make it a more efficient process for them because they do have a lot better understanding of what's going on. So this led us to the research question, which was, again, it was driven by the problem statement and focused on those same 3 errors, and we asked ourselves, okay, what is this level of detail that will allow us to improve the process and minimize the errors, the time on task, and the mental workload. So we kind of want to go in just a little definition on how we're defining improve. For us, it was, how can we allow companies to cut costs? How can we allow them to cut time, improve retention, all of those things. Improve is such a holistic approach here, in that we're trying to make things better in regards to, money, because that's what it's all about, really. So, and then error for us, we talked about it being an admitted step or an incorrect step. We had a couple different instances. One girl started taking more parts apart than we wanted her to, and obviously we had to stop that right away. And then we also had one instance where you had to remove a clamp and you had to loosen a nut, and you only had to loosen it to a certain point, and they ended up taking it all the way off. So, it still worked, but it wasn't necessarily exactly how the work instruction stated. Mental workload will be defined a little bit better later on. We'll talk about the test that we use to address this, the NASA TLX. So finally, we had our hypotheses, what we felt like was what was going to happen, what was going to be better, what was going to be worse. We broke these down based on the 3 variables we had, just so we could have a measurable for each one, and they could work independent of each other. The first one talks about we predicted the high level of detail would produce fewer errors than the low level, and then our null hypothesis, the high level of detail would show no change. And the next 2 are very similar, just discussing time to perform and lower mental workload.
Okay, so this is Cortona 3D. It's the So this is Cortona 3D. It's the visualization software that we used. We took the CAD models that we created and imported them into the software, where then we were able to manipulate them to make different actions, as you see, rotate and disappear. And pretty much it was our tool to communicate to our users, our test users, to show them what we wanted them to do. Test students, we tested AT376 and AT476 students. The mode of delivery was a laptop with a mouse. We wanted to do the best we could to simulate a desktop computer that Cessna would have their technicians to use. We measured errors, time on task, and mental workload, and also used NASA TLX, which is a subjective multidimensional assessment tool, which measures mental demand, physical demand, temporal demand, as well as performance, effort, and frustration. And all those put together gave us a good group of data. We also had data collection through observation, which was us as a team watching the students' work. It allowed us to see if they were struggling, if they had to go back to the computer more than once, if they did an extra step or not enough steps, and also through survey, which I'll talk about more in a second. This is our testing site. So the students tested on the computer and saw the animation or the work instruction right here, and then they walked around to around this barrier to where the actual part was down here. And we did that because Cessna specifically told us that their technicians have a 50-foot distance between their desktop computers and the stations themselves. And so by making them walk around, they had to actually remember what they saw, which obviously would be more difficult. We had a pre-questionnaire. We asked what their majors were and if they had any job experience. If they were FAE certified, years experience on working with aircraft, including school experience, academic experience, as well as any experience they might have in the field. If they were familiar with 3D software, either modeling or Cortona 3D, and then what specific types of software those were. This is a picture of a student actually manipulating the model now, going through the work instructions. We're watching to make sure that he wasn't doing anything that wasn't permitted. And then, next slide. The high level of detail and low level of detail models, the group that myself, Tony, and Nick are in, thank you. We had two different models that we used during our testing. So this is the low level of detail. The main basic parts of the model are there, but we took off all the features such as that, or added features that had no real value to the part. And if you go to the next slide. This is the model with everything added as it is seen on the actual part itself used by the technicians. So as you can see, there's, if you want to go back real quick, there's just a lot of features that we took off just to make it simpler and to see if that would make a difference in the actual testing itself. And then this is the actual technician or student taking apart the steps. And again, we're watching to make sure that they, if they omitted any steps or if they went too far or not enough.
All right. So it was important for us to gather data on their performance on working the piece and working the software, but it was also important to us to gather data on, you know, how they felt about the process and what they liked and what they didn't like. So we had our own post questionnaire as well as the NASA TLX test that we gave them that, you know, Zach talked about a little bit earlier. This was on our post questionnaire. As you can see, a lot of these are open-ended questions. We wanted to get their opinions on what was going on, what their preferences were. You know, we had how difficult did you find the task to be? Was it difficult to work with the 3D modeler, or was it more difficult to work with the actual part? We wanted to get this information so we could kind of figure out what were all the preferences, what did they like to work with the best. Next slide, please. As we talked about the NASA TLX, the NASA TLX is a way for us to get statistical numerical data on their actual feelings. We could put a result from 1 to 10, and they could say, you know, on a basis of what was the mental demand of this task. It could say from 1 to 10, so we could get hard numbers on their actual feelings, and we can see the results. It ended up we had 34 test subjects. We had 4 of them being FAA certified, and we had experience from 0 to 13 years. Some of those students that had 13 years experience are veterans. Some of them have worked in the military district of avionics, and some have worked actually out in aeronautical industry. 97% were trained in some form of 3D modeler. So that means almost all of our test subjects have touched some sort of either 3D modeling software, 3D visualization, a viewer, or manipulation, which is great for us because that means we'll have jobs in the future. So subjects were asked to rate 3D modeling on a 1 to 7 scale. 1 meaning that, you know, they had never touched any 3D modeler at all, ever before. And 7 being they use it on a daily basis. And we came out to get a 3.84. So somewhere right in the middle. And when we asked most of them face to face, they said they've touched a 3D modeler probably about once a week. All right, next slide, please. So here it is, the NASA TLX data that we were looking at. These are all our numbers and how we could actually get statistical data on their feelings. And as you can see, they're all fairly low, which is kind of what we were going for. We wanted to have a low demand. We wanted to have a low physical demand because we wanted this to be easy enough for them to complete the task and get good data on it, rather than it be so complex they either give up or don't want to do it anymore. So we also, from our post questionnaire, we could gather some information and some percentages, and we asked them, do you like doing the 3D work instruction more than your 2D paper workbook? And surprisingly, 91% said the 3D aided their comprehension, which is great news for us. That's why we were kind of doing this test. So that was good percentages on our part. Next slide, please. The largest difference we saw in the NASA TLX was the temporal demand. And that is, the temporal demand is, did they feel rushed? Did they feel like they were hurried at all in this? And we got the low level of detail was 5.3% higher, which means the student felt a little more rushed when they were working with the low level of detail. So, we came to a few conclusions about that, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The difference for the average time on task was fairly minimal. A high level of detail, 5 minutes and 37 seconds, while a low level of detail was 5 minutes and 30 seconds. We kind of came to our own conclusions about this as well, saying that the high level of detail, you actually have to infer more information from the screen. It takes longer to look at the screen and infer more data, so it actually took them a little bit more time. We did do our best to separate out the people who were very experienced from the unexperienced, because obviously if you have somebody who's been in the field for 13 years, they're going to run through it much quicker than somebody who's brand new at this. So we did our best to do that.
So this is just a visual display of the TLX results that Nick was talking about. As you can see, the temporal demand has the biggest difference there, but you can also see on the 1 to 10 scale, everything is very, very low. And like Nick talked about earlier, it's something that we were going for. We weren't trying to give them a complicated thing. If they came back with 6s and 7s, we would have been concerned, especially with what we're testing is how is this making it easier, not harder. So that was definitely good. We didn't see a lot of differences, but that's okay too. And then this chart here just kind of breaks down our 3 variables. It talks about time, number of errors, and mental workload. And then we've on the left here, each row, we talked about the range, the mean, the t-value, and the p-value. We set the p-value at 0.05 significance, and none of the t-values were underneath of that. So statistically, there was no significant difference, and that's why we have this row here. We did have kind of an outlier at the top with the high level of detail, the range at 1022. That was probably, I would say, 2 or 3 minutes longer than anybody else, just because they were doing some other incorrect steps. I believe that was the girl that went a little bit too far. But number of errors, as you can see, was very minimal, which again was good. They were doing it accurately, and part of that we think was due to the simplicity of the instruction. But other than that, the data is, it's very, very similar, so that's where we kind of looked at the subjective comments a little bit more, and you'll hear about those later on.
All right. Now at this point, if anybody needs to get up and stretch or do something, we do have the second part of our group coming up to speak now, and they're talking about screen capture versus animation, and they'll get into that. A lot of the data is overlapping because we use the same test subjects, so bear with us, and we'll let them do their thing here. Bring up Sam.
Hello, I'm half of the group working with views or screen captures versus animation, which consists of myself, Josh, and Brett. We, instead of focusing on the 3D models themselves, we focused on different delivery methods for these work instructions. So we had one, we'll go into more detail later, but we had one that was a playthrough sequence of an animation. The user can pause it at any time, pan, rotate, zoom, and one which was just a static image for step by step. And you'll see that later in ours. So for our previous groups, there was 2 that we're going to talk about here, since we're kind of a group standing on the shoulders of giants, with a lot of, or at least standing on the shoulders of CGT majors. But they tested for the same 3 variables, number of errors made, time on task, and overall mental workload. They worked with 2 different delivery methods, 3D PDF and Ngrain, which are both relatively similar to Cartona 3D, which is what we worked with. They didn't find a statistical difference between, oh wait, this is the next one. They found that Ngrain was better than the 3D PDF, which having reviewed those before we actually started our project, we agreed along those lines. Plane mechanics also tested for the, skipping around. Flight check technologies also tested for the same 3 variables: time on task, mental workload, overall numbers of errors made. They tested it using Cortana, 3D, and Ngrain, and they didn't find any statistical difference between the 2 delivery methods. So once again, we have an overall group problem statement, which is kind of leading our directive as a group, which is improving visual comprehension of aircraft work instructions in a digital form in a method that is clear, limits file size, and improves clarity. For our specific portion of the project, we focused on the need of whether animated or screen capture model-based work instructions are more effective when provided to maintenance technicians based on our 3 variables, as stated earlier. So for our research findings, we focused on delivery methods. We found one research stated that there was no significant difference in build times for an assembly when you compared animation versus static 2D diagrams. Another one found that groups receiving multiple gradient static images actually perform better than those receiving an animated walkthrough. And then we also looked into cognitive load and signal detection, which people who had user-controlled animations performed better than those and higher test performance. Okay. Animation versus screen capture, our research question. How will use of animated and screen capture model-based work instructions affect aircraft technician performance of maintenance tasks? To define that a bit more on our next slide, for the screen capture we used a user-controlled animation. They had a sequence of steps, and on each one, when you would click on it, it would highlight the part, and then it would disappear in the next step to show you that this part's being removed, along with the text-based instructions. The user at any time could manipulate the model, pan, zoom, rotate, so they're still getting the functionality of 3D while maintaining the simplicity of 2D. For our animation, we had an interactive animation sequence which would play through. The user can pause at any time, but they can't go back and rewatch steps. So our hypotheses are divided into our 3 variables: number of errors, time on task, and low mental workload, and then we have null hypothesis to go with that too.
Alrighty, this is a graphic that we used on our webpage. It's a simple drawing of the actual subassembly that we were dealing with. As you can see, this is a lot easier to decipher the actual different parts of the subassembly. You can see which ones actually are different from each other. And it's a lot easier to kind of comprehend for those who may not be as technically or visually oriented. So that's what we used for that. When we took our actual model, we plugged it into Cortana here. This is the model that we just put in Cortana. It doesn't have the work instructions in it, but you can see the motion with the different parts come off, disappear. And then we'll go on to the actual next slide. Okay, and just like the other half of our group, we tested the same group of students, AT 376 and 476. Same mode of delivery, laptop, or not a laptop, yeah, laptop with mouse. As they've said before, the other groups have tested on tablets and 2D and 3D task cards. As we were instructed from some of our sponsors, that this is what they wanted. We tested the same 3 elements: the errors, time on task, and mental workload. So that's pretty common through our group. We'll go to the next one. Okay, before the testing, we passed out pre-questionnaires to just kind of get a feel of kind of the experience, with the subjects that we were testing. Major job experience, are they FFA certified, years of experience and familiarity with 3D CAD softwares, and continue. Alrighty, and here, same procedure. We tested both methods using, because of the kind of time constraints and the amount of people we had to condense both of those. So as you can see here, they had to come around. They couldn't see the actual the laptop while they're working with the part, and vice versa. And we can continue from there. Here is where the students would actually look at the model. They were given instructions on what they could and could not do. As far as we've said, the animations you could play through, you could pause, you could zoom rotate, but then you had to continue on. You can go back to the beginning. And with the screen capture, you could play the steps individually. You could, if you were confused, you could zoom, rotate, do stuff like that. And then if you had to go back and look at other steps, you were allowed to do that. So this is a video of the actual Cortana with the work instructions. As you can see, this is the animated one. You would just click on the play. It would run through. You see the actual movement, your rotation of the screws. So this is a more lifelike actual application for that. Also, as you can see, the high level of detail model is used here, which we decided to put those two together. And the instructions are on the left. And then we can go on to the other one. You'll see here that this is a lot more kind of simplistic. It doesn't have the actual motion, the removal, the rotation stuff with the actual parts that are we're actually dealing with. So it just highlights. You read the instructions on the left, and then it disappears. And then you can continue. This is the actual model itself. As you can see, it's very kind of cluttered when you look at it in its whole. And right here, what it's showing is to kind of try to make the actual time testing and stuff like that more consistent. We instructed the students on what tools they can use for different steps. So you can just go back, continue to go back. As you can see, because if you had some students who weren't as familiar with how to assemble and disassemble, they may just sit there and just use your simple wrench the entire time, and of course that would take longer than if you did separate methods. So that's what we did to kind of try to control that variable. And then Josh will come in here with the post questionnaire.
All right, I'm going to wrap things up and tell you the kind of data and how we interpreted the results from the animation and the screen capture. We asked the same 6 questions in our post questionnaire that the level of detail group asked. We wanted to know if they've used 3D models, how often did they use them, how difficult was it. We wanted to explain any problems that they had with the task. Excellent. The testing pool was the same students as well. It was the exact same 34 students, 4 of which were FAA certified. The range, 0 to 13 years. The 13 years being some of them had experience in the Air Force. They were veterans. We thought it was interesting that 97% were trained in some form of 3D environment. The most common answer for that was they had taken a class where they learned basic modeling in CATIA. So they knew how to model using CATIA. They didn't have experience using visualization software like Cortana, but they did rate themselves with a 3.84 out of 7 from 1 to 7 scale, 7 being the most experience using on a daily basis. So these were moderate users of 3D related software. We've talked a lot about the NASA task load test. It was a survey that actually was developed by NASA. It has quite a bit of influence. Just to give you a little more information, it's been cited in about 550 studies. And if you would do a Google Scholar search on it, you're going to find about 3,600 articles that use the NASA TLX. So it has a pretty large influence. Now here's the actual bar graph data from the results for the NASA TLX categories on the animation versus the screen capture. It's interesting to note that the results for the animation group had higher mental demand, physical demand, and temporal demand. So they felt like they were slightly more physically, mentally demanded, and they felt like they were more rushed using the animation. Then if you go and look at the performance, going along with the screen capture, they rated themselves better in performance. So they had lower mental and physical demand, and they also felt like they did better. The scale is 1 to 10, 1 being completing the task perfectly and 10 being failing the task. And they rated themselves slightly over 1, which is 1 being perfection. So they felt like they did a pretty good job on this task, and animation was about 2. So we conclude that the higher mental work demand and physical demand actually caused them to feel like they didn't do as well in the task. Effort was slightly lower for the screen capture, and frustration was almost identical. Next slide, please. So after we had them fill out the post questionnaire, we showed them both methods. We said, which one would you prefer if you had the choice to use the static screen captures or the animations? 70% preferred the animation, even though the results showed that they felt like they were closer to perfection. The students that used the static screen capture views, they preferred to use the animation. So that was interesting, and like Nick said earlier, 90% preferred 3D over 2D. Here's an average of the NASA TLX data, and this is significant just to show that the frustration was slow, and the performance was very highly rated. They were 1.74 from a 1 to 10 scale in success. So they felt like they completed the task well. The average effort was 2.35. So we attribute the low effort, low mental and physical demands to the simplicity of the task. But that's what we were going for. We didn't want them to struggle with it. We wanted to focus more on the instructions rather than the task being too difficult. Now, like the level of detail group, our highest category for differences were in the temporal demand, how rushed did they feel. The animation group felt more rushed than the group that was looking at the screen captures. The reason for this, we've hypothesized, is the fact that while they're viewing the animations, they're having to retain a lot more information. The animation group, not only are they just seeing a highlighted part and then it disappearing, they're having to watch the part. For instance, if it's a bolt, they're going to have to watch it turn and then be removed from the object. So they're processing how it's moving and also what object is moving. So they spend a little bit more time working with the work instructions. Another thing that was interesting is, as you've seen, the test subjects would work at the work instruction using the computer, and they'd have to go across the wall and across the room to do the disassembly. The students that used the screen capture portion of the work instruction, they would go through at their discretion. For example, they would take maybe the first 3 steps, click, 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 obtain the information, then go to the disassembly, take apart those steps, go back to the work instruction, watch the additional steps, and finish it. Students who did the animation would watch it all. They'd watch it in one through, obtain all the information, go, and do it at once. They didn't break it down in their own terms. They did it as the animation showed, so they had to remember more as they took it over. Next slide, please. So the time for the animation was a little higher than the screen capture. Reasons for that are, well, these students that were using the screen capture, the step-by-step views, at their discretion, if they were more experienced technician, they would actually go through more quickly. They would spend less time on the computer, whereas the students that were using the animation would watch the whole thing no matter what. They had to watch it from start to finish. So that caused them to spend more time on the work instruction. And we have a lot of comments from the students that show how they felt about each one that we discussed earlier. Here's a chart similar to the level of detail one. We found it interesting that the fastest time was actually in the screen capture range. The longest times were identical for both, but the screen capture actually had the fastest for us, being 3 minutes and 48 seconds. The average number of errors for animation was slightly higher. The mean was 0.353, whereas the screen capture was 0.235. And the average mental workload was slightly higher too, being about 2.33 for animation and 1.94 for screen captures. And none of our data was statistically significant because our t-values were outside of the threshold of our 0.05 p-value. Next slide, please. So these are some of the comments that we received from the students. Even though the results were about the same, many of them preferred the animation. The thing that they really liked about the information, the main thing that we took from it was clarity. With the animation, there wasn't any confusion. They could see exactly how the part came apart. There was movement within the part, so just a highlight disappeared. We had all kinds of comments about, animation is easier to understand, things like that. Next slide. With the screen capture, things that people liked about it, the main focus on that was control and speed. Students liked the fact that when they were looking at these views, they could go through as they wanted. They could go through it at whichever speed they wanted. And some students felt that it was a more simple task. The views were all they needed. But we also had comments that said if the task would have been more difficult, then an animation would have been essential to provide the additional information. Nick's going to wrap things up for us.
Yeah, to kind of bring everything full circle on both groups, and quite frankly, we cannot conclusively 100% say which way is better than the other. Animation versus the screen capture, certain levels of detail. It really is dependent on the technician and on the piece. So we kind of came to our own few conclusions right here. If you have a part that has a lot of variability, such as, it gets a new revision every other week or every month, very complex part, a high level of detail animation is what we would recommend for doing that part, because that's going to give all the necessary information to somebody who's maybe not as familiar with the part, because it is a low frequency part. It doesn't come through the pipeline that much. Such as, a low variability, high frequency part, something that's done hundreds of times a day on the line. It would be important to have a low level of detail screen capture so the technician could work through it as fast as they wanted to, or at their discretion. The level of detail is significant in the part files, because as you guys know, aircraft have hundreds, thousands of parts. If you have a high level of detail part for every single 3D model, your part files are going to be massive. So, PDM is also another area that could go into. But as we said, you know, what we like to refer back to, we found the preference on the animated process, and that's something that we saw by 70%. So, you know, that's something that we took away from this, and that's what we'd recommend for those high detail parts. So, at this time, you can go ahead and go to the next slide, obviously. At this time, we'd like to move into the question and answer session. If you guys have anything, no holds barred, whatever you guys want to know, if you're still with us, we'll be more than glad to answer. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I know we had some
Sorry.
technical difficulties getting started this morning, but I think kudos to you guys. I think the project work shows excellent effort in terms of trying to establish what the hypothesis was and then appropriately test it. And I think you guys did a fantastic job of that. I think conclusion definitely makes sense with kind of where our heads were at. I think going into this. And we really absolutely appreciate you taking on these projects for us. I think it was great work. I'll ask anyone else here in the room if they have questions or comments.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, definitely.
You used the statement, attempting to make things more efficient for the sake of money. Is there a word missing from that sentence? Because as a pilot, I'm not so interested in how much it costs to fix something. I'm more interested in something
accuracy, I think. I mean, as well.
else. Safety.
Safety,
Yeah,
yeah.
let's go with safety, please.
Yeah.
Who was your 2D UI expert on the project? This is something that, not just you guys, it's been sort of bugging me on these legacy projects. No one's doing any testing as to whether or not the 2D informational display has any effect on the knowledge retaining in this. Font choices, color choices for the work environment, whether or not the text should be separated from the 3D environment. These are all important things to cognitive ability. And it would be great if you guys could make some notes in your presentation that the next group to pick this up maybe focuses on that, because UI informational layout is highly important.
Absolutely. And you know, we being a legacy project, we will pass it on, and we'll do our best. And each semester it keeps passing on to the next group. And I know past groups have worked with 2D information, but not to the extent that you're talking about. So we'll recommend that for sure in our next group.
It seems like we've really nailed sort of the 3D aspect of this and how to get the information in front of people. But I mean, I don't even know if Cortona allows you to customize the UI, but reading from the left and then looking to the right. I mean, if I click the link first and then I read, well, the animation's done by the time I get over there. So I need to know to read and then click and then look. So I think it's time to possibly start looking at whether or not the UI choices are right for this project. And hopefully take it to the next level. Because it is highly interesting seeing where this has gone over the past couple of years.
I want to build on what Jeff just said, because I think it's an important thing, and this is something that you guys have heard me talk about, and you've read it and seen it and other sorts of things. One of the challenges we fall into, and just the collective we in this space, right, is that there's been more and more functionality added to sort of the 3D CAD authoring environment, right? Which historically, to do that task that you guys would have done, somebody would have taken two-dimensional assembly drawings, which may have been printed from CAD or they may have been hand-drawn, but they would have taken those and combined those with a series of written textual instructions and worked between the two of them to go build or assemble or take apart or disassemble, whatever it was that we're talking about. And so one of the other challenges I think, and this, at least to me, speaks to what Jeff's talking about, is how much information, and this is something that Cessna or anyone else is going to have to decide, is how much information do we want to put into that three-dimensional model to be either extracted later, or how much do we keep separate from the model and combine it in some other environment, like a Cortona or a 3D Via or one of those other sort of CAD and PLM-centric compositing tools. But that's another thing that I think somewhere somebody, and maybe it's next semester's project or next year whenever we do this again, because I just want to echo Jeff's point, there's a two-dimensional element to this since we're still working on a computer screen.
Yep.
Right? We're not talking about holographic 3D glasses or anything like that yet.
Not yet,
We're talking about still working from a computer screen.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that needs to be in there somewhere.
Absolutely.
That's a good point because in our environment here we do our work instructions today in SAP, which is purely in our instance a textual environment. And now we're coupling on this graphics component to it. So we've had that question. How much writing do we do of step-by-step instructions supplemented by pictures, or do the graphics really drive and the text is minimalized? That's still something that we're looking to kind of uncover.
So Jason, this is Nate. Just out of curiosity, any plans to get rid of 3D VIA now that SAP owns Right Hemisphere?
No, not for us. We don't. We heard about that kind of right at the tail end of our selection process for the graphic solution. So we're locked into 3D VIA for the foreseeable future. So we're going to try and have it and SAP play together as best we can.
I know, I was just putting you on the spot, that's all.
And the more PLN expansions for us in the near future. We have the tools now. We're going to try and figure out how to make the best play of it. So.
Fair enough.
Any other questions in the back of the room or anything? Anybody not clear on some certain parts? Yes.
How much detail did you ask them to use when you asked them the question of how often you use a 3D modeler?
We said they rated on a 1 to 7 scale.
Right.
1 being they have never touched a 3D modeler, 7 being they use it on a daily basis. So somewhere in the week, or somewhere in the middle rather, we fell on a weekly or monthly basis. And if they rated right in the middle, we asked them directly, how often do you touch it? And most of them did say they see some sort of 3D modeler or viewer of that sort on a weekly basis. So obviously they're not touching it every day. They're not modeling. They're doing a lot of interpretation. But they have had class of it.
And it wasn't focused on your amount of knowledge. It wasn't necessarily, do you think you're really good at it? It's more just, how frequently do you feel like you're exposed? How much time have you spent in this environment? We're not necessarily trying to determine if you're extremely efficient at using this software.
It's just to figure out how familiar you are with the actual environment.
So building on that point, do you guys think the level of familiarity that they had, yeah, but I'm jumping in. Do you think the level of familiarity that they had though? I mean, because to Jeff's point, I think you guys are making sort of an unstable assumption in there. That if you use this, simply by virtue of osmosis, right? You now have some level of familiarity that all of a sudden qualifies you to be able to do this. Do you think it's important to discern at any sort of more granular level what somebody's familiarity with three-dimensional tools is?
Yeah. The basic knowledge we were trying to gain was, are they familiar with understanding what 3D is and understanding what 3D work instructions are? As far as Cortona is concerned, we gave them a 20-second know-how, just a tiny little training session right before they started their testing on how to pan, zoom, and everything like that. So they, if they did not understand the knowledge of how to control this software, we gave it to them, and they understood it. So we just wanted to make sure that they've heard of 3D, or else we were going to have to start at an absolutely basic level and go talk about, okay, nowadays this is what they're doing. So, we gave all of them a 20-second run-through, and they were all able to manipulate the software easily. They rated that on the NASA TLX, so we were pretty happy that it was very easy to understand for them.
Perfect. Let's take my point back from Nate. I was concerned that maybe, in proper questions and polling is a whole science in itself. If you ask me that question, I'd give you multiple 7s, because I actually touch multiple 3D modelers in the course of the day. If you ask me how many times I actually do modeling in them, I would give you a big fat 0, because I use them as compilers.
Right.
I write tools inside of it.
Yeah.
And so there's a level of detail in that question that I think maybe needs to just be a little more specific.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Where do you think that preference for, this gets at something that's always sort of driven me crazy from a software user point of view, is that people say that they prefer X. In this case, they seem to prefer the animated sequence, right? But yet, it's the one that arguably takes them more time,
Yep.
causes them to incur the highest mental workload, and I think arguably may not be the most efficient method of presentation, yet almost to a person, they said, but we prefer this one.
Exactly. It's kind of weird. A lot of people think it's cooler, to be flat out honest with you. A lot of people like the animation more because they can get more information from it. While it makes them work harder, while it makes them take more time, they appreciate the fact of that animation. So once they went to the model, they understood, okay, the clamp comes off like this. They understood it better, and they kind of figured out that, you know, that was a better way they like to watch it because they can refer their animation to back to movies and everything else, whereas a screen capture, they had to infer a lot more.
Do you think there are concerns, though, about, to Jeff's point, safety, accuracy? Efficiency's great, but accuracy and safety are arguably more important in this sort of environment. You know, I'm thinking about something that just came across, you know, Reuters the other day where, you know, these fuel clips on a line inside Boeing 787 weren't assembled correctly at the factory, right? Now, I don't know what method of assembly information they got, whether it was, you know, the typical traditional kind or whether it was some of Boeing's model-based stuff. But the point is, you know, if there wasn't a certain level of redundancy in the 787, if there weren't other safeguards in place, you know, either smaller aircraft or older aircraft or those that don't fall under the same kind of guidelines that large commercial airliners do, you know, this is really a safety thing. You know, we've talked about this a lot with, you know, compliance from the FAA due to the substantial risk for loss of life or property. I mean, that's a huge thing. And so, you know, how do you get past this idea that somebody may prefer something that's arguably not good for them, so to speak? How do you get past that?
I'll take it.
I mean, I think you just, you know, you kind of take their preference and, I mean, you're gonna make them do whatever's gonna be better for the company in that sense of accuracy. And I think a lot of this preference is, you know, we would show them the 2D one, they would see the animation and they're like, oh, that's cool, because they didn't get to see it previously. And I think part of that is just because this is still becoming more new all the time. You know, we don't have 30, 40 years of experience in this animation work instruction. You know, people haven't seen this kind of thing, and these kids are dealing with, you know, these paper work instructions, and they get to see something move. It's like, oh, I want to do that, and it's more of just, and I think if, you know, if they had been seeing it over and over again, I don't know that the preference would be as distinct if they could see it in 3D, whether or not it actually moves or whether it, you know, it just shows you what you need to do. It, you know, having that experience, I think, maybe kind of takes the cool factor down, and then they understand, hey, I can do it quicker like this. I can control the tempo of the work instruction. I don't have to sit here and watch the whole thing. I mean, if I'm an expert in something, I want to be able to dictate how fast I can go and realize, you know, this is going to make me do it better.
But to address the accuracy and the safety, I mean, that's why we kind of talked about it really depends on the technician, it depends on the part that they're working on. And that's why we said, you know, a corporation could look at a hybrid way of doing it. You know, certain safety features that need to be higher in detail, you put them in that higher level of detail, the animation, something that, or is going to make the technician understand better. And so that's why we recommend different methods for different parts. I think it really is up to the discretion of the corporation and what they want to use, that it's going to get the job done correctly and efficiently.
What do you think might happen if, this is sort of a hypothetical, but, you know, the average age of your participants was probably, what, 21, 22?
We averaged 20 to 24, or well, we had a range of, I think 19 to 25, 26.
So my average is fairly accurate.
Yes.
So the point is that there's a novelty effect there, right?
Yeah.
To some degree. Do you think there would be the same sort of reaction from a novelty effect point of view for the average age of, let's say, a Cessna assembly technician, which, I don't know, Jason, off the top of your head, what's the average age of the people that work in your shop?
Probably closer to 35, I would guess.
Okay. So what I'm wondering is, do you think there would still be some sort of novelty effect? Do you think, if there is, do you think it would be bigger?
Quite frankly, I think it would. But that's me talking as a 23-year-old who grew up with this kind of stuff. And I think, you know, the whole aspect in a corporation that nobody likes change. And you got to deal with certain changes that are tough. And you know, whether an age group or a generation understands things differently. I think, you know, as this process becomes, you know, more widespread, I think it is going to become more common and people are going to understand it much clearer, much easier through all age groups, not just the younger generation that's grown up with it. And I think, you know, it's all a part of the training process, and that goes all the way back to the discretion of the company, what they feel is best for their technicians. So in short, I do think there is sort of a novelty there. I think it, you know, quite frankly, I think there is, but, you know, that's the animation side.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you, actually, because I know when we've done some of our, as we looked at companies that were doing 3D products, they almost always show us animations. They very seldom show just the 3D and being able to turn it. It's always some sort of animated something, and when we present it to management and want to get buy-in, we find it better to present an animation versus the views. But when it comes down and rubber meets the road, that's why we kind of chose the view aspect to really get it to the shop floor and allow them to do it quicker.
That makes sense.
The animation does seem to have some sort of novelty to it. I don't know exactly why, but
Right.
Don't you think there's more information in the 3D model and the animation than there is in the static?
Yes.
Yeah.
How many, did you observe any students turn the nut the wrong way? Did
I
you
don't know.
observe-
From the observation, guys, did you
No.
see anybody
I mean,
do that?
not like,
by the way?
actually, there's one person that was tightening the clamp, and he thought he was loosening it, but then he quickly stopped. It wasn't.
Okay, so when we talk about level of literacy,
I would say that'd be more of a user error than it was watching the video.
did that particular person watch the animation or had the animated side, or did they have
That
the
specific error, I can't
static
remember.
side? Well, see, that's what I'm saying, that,
Right.
that these assumptions are being made, probably without really looking at the amount of data that's being integrated too, because in an animation, you're gonna have a tremendous amount more of data, i.e. which way to turn a ball.
Yeah, and that was one of the things we talked about, was you get to see everything as well as what part, where, and how. You know, you see more of the how, and, you know, there, in our case, you know, everything was very self-explanatory, but, I mean, there are plenty of cases out there where, you know, you either have to know how you're doing it, or there has to be a very detailed description of how you get this part away from that part without
Or a
banging into
mentor, you know, a mentor or
Yeah,
instructor,
exactly.
or, you know, something has to be there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that just brings up a whole set of questions. Would you say then that this product, I kind of heard it, but I don't know if I directly heard it, that it's more directly related to entry-level personnel and their initial training?
We wanted to apply to more test subjects. Quite frankly, we were trying to do the best that we could within our limits.
Okay.
We had 34 test subjects. We could have opened up our testing pool, but that would have skewed our data because people wouldn't have been, you know, acclimated to the aviation industry. So, you know, we could have had 60, 80 test subjects, but it really wouldn't have done us any good in the end, you know. And we would like to test older test subjects, you know, I mean, FAA certified.
Sure.
But quite frankly, we had to do the best with what we had, and what we had was a class that, you know, had minimal experience with a few experienced guys sprinkled in there.
You know, so you didn't try to break the data down between those with experience and those that were novice?
We do have that data broken down, but as far as putting it into the overall what we're trying to do, I mean, it wasn't significantly relevant to answering our problem
Can you
statements.
pull
Well, and that was something that Buckley was asking about as well, and we, you know, we really only had, I think, maybe 3 or 4 guys that showed some experience. So, you know, and I think he was asking if, you know, we could email or send him the information
Sure.
of, you know, how do those experts compare, so that was something that, you know, we might try to dig up for him. But, you
Yeah.
know, we just had such a small number of test subjects that actually had some experience. It was really hard for us to draw conclusions just based on, you know, a couple people, just because.
And with the
too many
simplicity
variables.
of the task, the experts really didn't blow the other guys out of the water. I mean, they were a
Well, see,
little bit
that's
better,
what I was trying
but
to see, were there any trends
it wasn't
that you
difficult
observed
enough.
in that may have contributed to that,
No,
you know, novelty effect or whatever?
they
you
weren't
wanna call
extreme
it?
outliers
Okay.
or anything like that. The fastest guy wasn't one of the experts, and the slowest wasn't obviously either. But they were about normal, really.
Okay,
in line
what
with everyone
drove
else.
your guys' decisions to determine the simplification of the models?
We needed to keep.
How did you make those designs?
Oh, actually, make the low level
Yeah,
of
how
detail.
did you decide that instead of it being circular, it was gonna be a block, or instead of it being, you know?
We tried to,
geometry shape?
I mean, you actually did the model.
Yeah.
We tried to take away the features of the model that would kind of still represent the shape of it. We wanted the overall shape, but as far as like the chamfers, all the rounded edges, certain nuts and bolts and aspects. You know, we wanted to take away as much detail as we could, but still keep constant the general shape so you'd be able to look at it and understand. And that's where we kind of had to step in a little bit more than we wanted to kind of decide where that level fell. And, you know, quite frankly, we were just trying to make something that would produce an effect among the students.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think the biggest thing was we wanted to show drastic differences with our level of detail. But, you know, there might be, I mean, I'm sure there's 3, 4, 5 different levels of detail within, you know, certain models. But we wanted to go as much as we could on the high end and probably as much as we could on the low end.
Are there any standards that exist for that procedure? And is there anything in the literature that you found that would suggest how to approach that?
Well, within our literature, we were trying to obtain basically the removal of all non-essential features, features that weren't essential for
How
the
did you
distance.
determine non-essential?
Essential feature is something that had to be like it wouldn't come apart without a certain bolt hole or a place for the bolt,
Okay.
a bolt or anything like that. Anything that was extraneous that basically just added more visual information, we
Right.
removed. So
Okay.
Kind of just functionality was the biggest
Mhm.
thing. It was if something was required to show the functionality of what it needed to do, we definitely, you know, kept that in there.
And based on that too, why yellow to flash to show someone that's the part?
That was just kind of the default thing.
Why not purple? Why not
Well,
red?
as we were going into the software, none of us had used that. I think a couple used 3D Via, but that's just the flash look yellow. And
Quite frankly,
usually
yellow
what
is
they
stand out.
it's the
use.
best contrast. I mean, we used
Yellow's
was it?
usually what
Wait a
they
minute.
use because it's got the highest contrast in terms of that gray background.
Shows a
Then-
physical
then why did
highlighting
you
of a
have
part
red
against the
lettering
gray
on a
background.
black background?
yes.
That's also how
That's
it's
a link.
relatively high contrast.
Yeah.
I was like,
Black red.
okay, I kind of get this, but what the heck was that? Unless we turned the lights down really low, we couldn't have seen any of that data. I'm sure people back there didn't see that data over there, even though we did allude to it, so I was just curious.
Can you bring up your elevator pitch?
Yes. All the way up to the top.
Super fast computer.
I'm running out of battery on this phone real quick.
The speed of the elevator in noise should not be considered anything indicative of an elevator speed.
I hope not.
I think that this slide and the slide after it should possibly be reversed because your elevator statement is a thesis.
Mhm.
And so it's really sort of broken the bounds of elevator statement by probably about 80 or 90 floors.
Yep.
And my other question there, just on the presentation is, you got a lot of white space in your bar graphs because even though you normalized on 0 to 10, you didn't even cross the 4 boundary.
Yeah,
I would
we looked
adjust
at
your bar
breaking
to
it.
Make the bars bigger.
Right, we looked at breaking it, but then, you know, we were afraid that it wouldn't get the point across that everything did come up or fairly low, which is what we were trying to get across. And that was the most important thing we wanted you to take away from that slide.
Okay, not
Is-
the differentiation.
No, we wanted to speak out the differentiations, but we wanted you guys to visualize actually how low everything fell in the NASA TLX.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. Any other questions from your end, Mr. Buckley?
I don't think so.
Have anything else from the audience in the room?
Could you say, no,
All right. We got one.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, let me get this straight then. Do you guys have any data or any research that shows that users actually do prefer 3D over 2D? Because from what your guys' testing seemed to show is that you guys had a pre-questionnaire that asked for level of familiarity with 3D or 3D instructions. And then you had a 3D instruction and kind of an experiment where they would see these 3D instructions and then do an exercise or a task based off of that in submissions. And then after that, you had a post-questionnaire that asked them if they prefer 3D over 2D. Don't you think there's a response bias there, though?
Actually, the pre-questionnaire, we didn't ask them specifically on the pre-questionnaire what their familiarity level was with 3D. So we asked them, we were using the pre-questionnaire as our determinant to see if they were qualified test subjects. That wasn't to gather the actual final data that we were going to be using. Our post-questionnaire, we did ask specifically, what do you prefer here? And at some points we had open-ended questions so we could get their original genuine response, and we had confined questions that would say, you know, what do you prefer over this? And the NASA TLX helped us understand what their feelings were on that. So when we came up with those percentages, the 70% prefer the animation over the screen capture, that was hard statistical data that we grabbed from our post questionnaire.
But you didn't actually test their familiarity or what they would value in 2D instructions.
That
versus
wasn't our
3D.
our project wasn't addressing 2D at all. I mean, that was something that has been addressed in previous projects before, and that was something that, you know, we didn't really want to hit on that at all. And there might have been, you know, a couple people more focused on the 2D aspects, but that, you know, that just wasn't our focus on our
Yeah, that's
project
what-
more than anything.
Their
Past
basis-
projects figured out
Yeah,
that the
there
3D
were
was
other
better.
projects Before you guys, I could see that.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, the data from that one was that the experts preferred the 2D stuff, but the novices preferred the 3D stuff.
That makes sense though.
And they do work with a 2D work instruction. They actually have a handbook of a work instruction that we had compared to when we asked if you prefer the 2D or the 3D. It was a comparison between the one they currently use and what we implement.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it actually possible to add high-resolution textures to your models in whatever Cortana?
Cortana 3D.
Because like looking at it from like a game aspect or whatever, most people use low poly models and then high-resolution textures or whatever to add the missing information.
Mhm.
So did you guys? Is it possible? I guess.
It is possible, but quite frankly, when you're working with aircraft work instructions and you have a massive assembly,
Right.
if you put textures on every single thing in there, it's actually going to be information overload. You're going to get so much. So, you know, when we focus, when we focus on the 3D modeling aspect in a manufacturing basis, you know, it's obviously not entertainment. If it was an entertainment thing, we'd be doing textures and cool animations and stuff like that. But right now, we're just trying to get across the information necessary to complete the manufacturing task.
Right. I guess like my question actually is geared towards the low poly model or the lower resolution model to add the missing information, so you don't have to use the really
We didn't-
high.
We didn't actually deal with differences in resolution. Like that would have been one parameter we could have looked at in making the difference between high level of detail and low level of detail, but they're technically the same resolution.
Okay.
The challenge comes in the original model and how it's made. Models coming out of a CAD system are made mathematically much different than
Right.
poly models for gaming or animation. And the challenge is, not that I don't think your idea is good, the trouble to post-process those models down to some sort of low poly count is, it takes all of the cost advantage and cost saving of having a 3D artifact at your disposal anyway. It just throws all that out because of the time you'd have to spend to get it into a polygonized form to be able to do that. That's the problem.
Yes.
I want to tell you that I think having sat through all those legacy projects for the last 15 years, I think you did an outstanding job reflecting back and actually walking into Professor Burton's office and grabbing those tomes off the shelf and doing the homework. I think you did an outstanding job building on, I think the young lady referred to it as shoulders of giants.
Yep.
I think that was outstanding.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Second question is, when you approach these kids out in the aircraft, did you instruct them as to what they were about to see, or did they just take it intuitively?
We gave them a quick debriefing on what we were.
Okay, stop right there. How would you do that in the real world?
Training.
Who comes with you?
The training process in the real world.
In other words, if your solution, your answer doesn't stand by itself, then it comes with a human being. Going back to the original UI question, in terms of how much information do they have to know to be able to navigate this?
Right.
Same as you would when you learn a new piece of software,
Absolutely.
a new video game.
Yep.
It's always friendlier when somebody's right there going, hey, turn left, turn right, go up, go down, this is a smart bomb.
Right.
And 5 minutes into it, you get it.
Right.
Did you find that to be true at all? Did you?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. I think if we wouldn't have given them the debriefing, or for some of them
It would be a brief, not
a brief, not a debrief, sorry, given them the briefing, or showed them how to navigate Cortana actually with the rotating and panning and zooming, they would have had trouble navigating the work instruction. The steps were not necessarily counterintuitive, but you had to know there was a certain area on that you had to click. You couldn't click the full text, you had to click a button next to the text. They had to know these things before. And
we gave the exact same, it was literally a 20-second run-through to each student. We gave the exact same run-through to each test subject the exact same way, so they were all on the same playing field as soon as they started the test themselves. But you're right, that training process is needed in any software you bring into industry in any company. I think it's important that, you know, everybody understands what they need to be doing in order to complete their task.
Good, thanks. You know, to build on that, we often interact with the model, pan, zoom, and rotate in a CAD system by some combination of mouse buttons and/or keystrokes, right? And you know, sort of meant to speed things up rather than going up to the view menu and picking pan and then interacting with the screen, right?
Yeah.
But you know, to that point, are the tools like Cortana or 3D Via or Right Hemisphere or Ngrain or any of the others that are sort of these graphics, text, authoring, training, assembly instruction kinds of packages, can those be modified in a way to put, you know, maybe there's a button that says start here. You know, maybe there's these up, down, left, and right sort of arrows, you know?
So like an animated training process?
You know, map it to the Xbox controller. I don't know. My point is that are these tools flexible enough to allow you that level of customization?
Yeah.
This is kind of what I was asking about with the UI stuff.
Yep.
Because I would, unfortunately, would go polygonal. I'd take the whole thing and throw it in Unity and put a custom control system and a custom UI on it.
Yeah.
That's from the game space.
Yeah. So, I mean, your question referring to, can this be done?
Yeah.
Quite frankly, I mean, that's a question for a
I would
future
think-
group.
Yeah, I would hope 3D View could do it. I mean, it's, you know,
Well, actually, they are working for different controllers for 3D Via. There's someone out in California who's got a sort of pen tool paired with glasses. It looked really cool. I'm not sure how much of that was rendering though. But they're working on different sort of more intuitive methods rather than your traditional mouse keyboard.
Yeah.
So I know they're working with a couple, they're not working with Cortana, but several of the large, like there is a Maya, 3D Via, and another one that they're working with for that.
I mean, I think we're just sort of, at least from my perspective anyway, we're just sort of picking at things now. But,
Right.
you know, to Jeff's point, the gentleman behind us, and the question from over there is just one of the things that you guys, or at least those of us that work in this space from PLM point of view, are to some degree hamstrung by is the workflow. In the sense that you go from, you know, highly precise, NURBS-based artifact CAD model, right, to some less than that derivative of it into, in this case, an assembly, disassembly sequence. How do you configuration manage this stuff, right? Because as soon as an engineering change rolls down the pike, what you've created there is now obsolete.
Right.
And it's got to go to Rev 2 or 3 or Rev X, whatever it is, right? And so if that process becomes too cumbersome, right? And especially if you've polygonized it, rolled it into Unity, rolled it into wherever, you know, those are just extra steps along the way that make this configuration control an absolute nightmare. So how do how do we mitigate that?
Well, when using the actual 3D Cortana, we actually kind of ran into that where we would include parts or not include them. And once you get something in there, like your model, if you don't have a part in there that you need, you have to start all over. And I mean, that's importing the part, adding the actual animations. So that was very frustrating in that aspect, but.
You know, so interestingly enough, you know, Cortana is licensed and sold by Siemens, right? And 3D Via is licensed and sold by Dassault. And, you know, I don't know as much about that one as I do the other, but, you know, wouldn't you think that this idea to sort of have some kind of reference to link between those things,
Absolutely.
such that you didn't have to start over, I mean, wouldn't that be a good thing?
absolutely. I mean, I think on the PLM side, as far as, you know, there's changes that happen all the time. If there is a way to link to your CATIA files or your part number or, you know, whatever it might be, I mean, it's essential, I think, for them to, you know, to use these kinds of work instructions on, you know, on a daily basis. That you can trust the fact that you always have the you know, the latest and greatest assembly.
Yeah.
Now, how many times do products get built to the wrong print or machined to the wrong print? Unfortunately, it happens far too often. All right, I'm done.
You good? Done? All right. Well, thank you all for attending, and we appreciate you coming out.